Okay, so it's no coincidence that we look at Japanese influence at this moment in our curriculum. Um, there is a great interest in all things Asian during the Industrial Revolution. China has remained generally very resistant to foreign trade despite persistent attempts from European countries. And this produces a pretty negative external view of China from the point of view of many Western countries. This, coupled with the kind of opium perception of China, doesn't help China. So, this serves as somewhat of a cautionary tale for why Japan is interested in bridging cultural ties with the West. So in 1853, a U.S. naval officer named Matthew Perry is sent on a mission that is essentially to strong arm the Japanese into trading with the West. The U.S. is interested in pursuing trade with the West, and we're trying to use Japan as a kind of economic driver. So the U.S. succeeds. And as a little bit of background, Japan had been operating as an independent island nation ruled by the military or the shogunate government, as it's known, since approximately 1600. So this meant that the system of government was still the feudal system. The feudal system was a system where there were few who owned the land, and then the majority of the population worked the land in service of those few landowners. We saw this in Europe before a lot of the cultural revolutions, so Japan was still in this mindset. And then the emperors of previous eras of Japan were mainly figureheads that had no power in the shogunate government. So they were just kind of dummy emperors. So one of these young emperors that didn't really have any power during this time seized control over the military government and actually ended up seizing power to take back power for the hands of the emperors. And he coins this new term, the Meiji dynasty. And this new Meiji period is one where the West and the East are now in constant two-way conversation. So here we have on the left an image of this new Meiji emperor, the young Meiji emperor that seizes control on the left in 1872 and on the right in 1873. And this particular image illustrates an interesting thing that happens very quickly with this new Meiji dynasty. The Meiji emperor realizes through his own investigation, he realizes that the image of himself as his official emperor portrait on the left is not going to promote a progressive and global perspective to the rest of the world. So after his first, I suppose, year in power, he ends up sending members of his cabinet to other Western countries to document and learn from what is happening there and have a more global perspective on the world. And it's no coincidence that a year later, which is relatively quickly, he would like a new official portrait, and he wants to be seen and perceived as more of a Western style emperor, someone who is friendly with the West. And so he changes his clothing dramatically. And you can tell this is an outward stylistic way of displaying his allegiance here. So one of the actual documents we have of this is in 1868. He creates something called the Charter of 1868, or commonly known as the Oath of the Common People. And this is a written document that states a couple progressive ideals. So it's called the Oath of the Common People for a reason. It states a commitment to public education, and this ideal of public education was modeled actually on the U.S. public education system. It states a law declaring that people now have the right to pursue whatever profession they want. And this is a new concept coming from a feudal system. This is something that has just happened in a lot of the European revolutions. So when you have the French Revolution in 1789, a lot of these ideas about liberty and personal rights are built into this. And this is, of course, built into our American Constitution. So this Meiji emperor is realizing, okay, these are the principles or ideals of Western society that the societies are founded on, the governments are founded on, and I'm going to go ahead and adopt this before my people revolt, and why don't we try to modernize together? And then lastly, in this charter, he displays an interest in and a commitment to technology. So technology such as steamships or railway, big technology that's going to change and influence how the society functions and really the daily life of everyday citizens. So this is going to influence architecture in many ways. The new openness with the West means that the U.S. in particular is now going to be exposed to Japanese culture. And I would say Asia at this time is rather mysterious and somewhat undocumented to the Western eye. So seeing this culture would have really been fascinating and quite fashionable at the time. And then this image that is now on the screen takes us back to a topic in a project that we discussed previously a couple weeks back, which is the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893 in Chicago. And this is the master plan that we have in Chicago that is nicknamed the White City. And Richard Morris Hunt is the master planner of this society. And they give Japan a pretty significant portion of land and then also placement, urban siting within this actual World's Fair. And so here is the Japanese pavilion that we're looking at on the screen. So in 1893, this Japanese pavilion was said to be one of the more popular places or exhibits to go see at this show. And you can see here, this is a traditional Japanese style architecture that takes into account a couple principles we'll discuss in a minute. But this is really a very kind of radical moment for people in the United States to be able to see and interact with this architecture. Very, very, very few people or common people in the United States would be able to travel to Japan and would see, or I should say, would even see artistic artifacts, representations, or documentation of this style of architecture. So this is a radical piece of education and enlightenment for the United States perspective on Japan. And then here's another image that shows the siting of the Japanese pavilions in conjunction with Lake Michigan. So this is a particularly nice lakefront site, and this again also has to do with the United States paying respect to and obeying these certain rule sets or laws of Japanese design. And a lot of this has to do with relationship to the landscape and particularly framing of views and natural elements in connection with architecture. So this is all in a response to these principles in Japanese architecture. And then, of course, there's a commercial aspect to this. There is, you can just see kind of in the center of the screen here, the sign that says Japanese Bazaar on this building, that this is a shopping area in conjunction with or kind of next to the World's Fair. So there are many stores that open up to sell souvenirs. I mean, it's kind of like if you go to a sports game now, you're going to have stores around selling, I don't know, fan memorabilia, etc. So this Japanese bazaar here illustrates a little bit about how people wanted to kind of take home a piece of this culture. And even though this is not part of the Japanese country's exhibit, not part of their official Japanese pavilion, the style of this type of Japanese architecture is used to build this building. So you can see it's starting to kind of pervade modern culture. And then this last example from the World's Fair is just a souvenir. So this is a piece of kind of paper fan that is based absolutely on Asian influence. And you can see some of the scenery that exists here and then some of the human depictions, the painting. So this is all part of this kind of interest or fascination at large in pop culture with Japanese culture. So then a couple things that filters in. This will be a little bit of a quick discussion, but some sort of summary of how the West, particularly Western architecture, is influenced by traditional Japanese architecture. So at this time, traditional principles of Japanese architecture are going to be borrowed by a lot of turn of the century architects and early modernists. And then conversely, in Japan, this Meiji dynasty starts to build in Western styles. So you see an influence back and forth architecturally. So to be able to understand this and how we can see Japanese influence within our world, I'm taking a couple examples here from traditional Japanese architecture spanning from 14th century to 17th century here. So this particular example image is from a tea house in Ritsuren Park in the Takamatsu Prefecture area of Japan. And the tea house is a program or a typology that exists in traditional Japanese settings, usually concurrent with or kind of on the same site as a house or as a temple. And the Japanese tea house is always a separate building set off in the landscape of very kind of humble proportion and scale. And it's just used for traditional Japanese tea services. So in this image, we see a very clear framing of the landscape. So I have framed views listed here as one of the principles of Japanese architecture that we're going to see borrowed. Very clear framing of what your openings in your buildings show you and how you can control these frames. And one of the ways you can control these frames is particularly these things, which are moving screens known as shoji screens. So here, this is that shoji screen. And these are a thin rice paper. So here, even though they look entirely opaque, this would have some level of translucency. Not transparent, so you can't see through it, it's not glass, but it has translucency. So even if these things are closed, if it's bright outside, there is some sunlight that will filter in. So you'll get a little bit of brightness here. But these shoji screens can be altered. They can be moved. They don't have to stay in a fixed position. This is part of the flexible space principle that exists within Japanese design. And then within this image, one of the last things that's worth pointing out here is this tatami mat on the ground. And this becomes a unit of measure and a way of really organizing, defining, and planning, doing interior space planning with Japanese structures. And so the tatami mat is meant to have a relationship to the human body. And this mat, which I have here, the mats vary from region to region in Japan, but an approximate size of these is maybe 90 centimeters by 180 centimeters. And that would be enough for one person to comfortably lay down flat, or two people to sit facing each other cross-legged style. So this is the traditional unit of measure that we see, and the proportion of this takes on the 1 to 2 proportion. You can see 90 times 2 is 180, and that's based on this ken, what's called a ken system or unit of measure here that was common for traditional Japanese architecture. So within this, there's an adherence to strict proportion. There is a unit of measure, which in this case is the tatami mat, that is based on human scale and human usage. There are very clear framed views that create a connection with the landscape or the exterior. And then there's flexible, movable space, which we see in the shoji screens here. So one of the other types of screens, this flexible space continues, and one of the other types of screens that exist is the Fusama screen, or what's known as the Fusama screen. And these are solid, opaque screens, and so they're not paned, or they don't have kind of wood mullions on them like the shoji screen does. These are blank, big open canvases essentially, and they turn into canvases, and they often house decoration here. So shokai, this term, is a principle of Japanese design that means borrowed landscape. So you're going to frame a view of a landscape when you have an actual landscape to look at, like the last image in the garden that was beautiful outside. But when you don't have an image to look at, or I shouldn't say image, I should say a landscape to look at, a view, you can create a view. You can borrow landscape and paint this into the structure or into the place. And so in this, we see these kind of golden Fusama because they're painted and they have gold in this paint. So that's why they're called golden Fusama. But this indicates or illustrates a borrowed landscape. And you see that this is supposed to be an abstracted representation of different elements of Japanese landscape. There's bamboo trees, there's kind of cherry blossoms over here, lily pads, so different elements of this structure stay here. This is from the Ginkakuji Temple in Kyoto from the early 16th century. And then another principle that has actually been visible in both of the last examples, but is very clear in this example, is the idea of obscured boundaries. So as you have so much flexible space and so many different attempts to frame views and sequence the movement through these structures, the boundaries can become very flexible and very obscured. So there's no hard boundaries, very few hard boundaries, I should say. And many of these boundaries are not fixed. So depending on the season, depending on the temperature, depending on the time of day or the sunlight. All of these boundaries are going to shift. So these houses are somewhat alive in this way. They're always changing. And this is the Katsura Imperial Villa in Kyoto also, which is in the late 16th century. And this is a very good example of a couple other principles. So this is the floor plan of Katsura. We were just inside it in the last image. And in this floor plan, a couple of very important principles that will absolutely connect with the early modern are the asymmetry that is visible here and the idea that there is no central axis to this plan. There's no central axis with which we could build symmetry off of. It's not centralized, but it does have the idea of organic growth built into it. So you can just see I like this plan because it has the tatami mat or the ken proportion illustrated here with these dotted lines. And if you look at it, this ken proportion or the tatami mat continues to repeat. It creates some interesting shapes that then as an aggregate can continue to be tacked on. And this thing seems like it could grow in many directions, kind of up, out. The only thing that seems to be protecting or blocking it here is the relationship to the landscape. So some of this stuff is indicating the Japanese garden design and the landscape. And then the spaces that are not decorated with this kind of dotted tatami mat grid here have this stripe, which is indicating that's a deck space or an outside space. So you can see the inside and the outside being meshed together very well in this floor plan. So in order to get from this area in the villa to this area in the villa, you have to use the outside space. There's kind of a porch framing a lot of these spaces. This allows for the flexible boundary. It allows for the framing of the view when you can set up a bunch of different levels of connection to the earth. And let's see, one thing that's worth noting here in the tea house space is that within these tea house structures, it's common to have, and within a lot of traditional Japanese architecture, it's common to have the structure lifted off the ground to further obscure the boundaries, so you don't necessarily understand the relationship of how the building meets the ground when you're inside of it. And then this attempt to raise it off the ground also helps elevate the view and creates a better view, so you can frame the view with more specificity here. Okay. So coming back to our examples here, one of the often cited examples here of traditional Japanese architecture is Ginkakuji, which is a temple in the Kyoto prefecture in the late 1500s. And this just serves to fill in a little bit more information that we haven't touched on here about the facade or the exterior of these spaces. This illustrates the idea of the large eaves, so the heavy, kind of large, wide, almost cantilevered roof. Produces a couple effects. Japan has the tendency to get very hot in the summer, so this shades and reduces sunlight gain on the interior, and then also adds a stylistic element here. And this will also be referenced in, I would say, early 1900s architecture in the U.S. Maybe not in modern architecture necessarily, but definitely in early craftsman architecture in the United States. And then this image also indicates a little bit of a relationship with the garden and with the relationship to the landscape. So traditional Japanese architecture and almost all these, well, a lot of these, not this one or this one, but this image, our floor plan of Katsura and then our exterior of Ginkakuji show that these pieces or elements of architectural building are never seen as impartial to the landscape. Their siting and their placement within a Japanese garden is very important. And the relationship to nature, again, the framing of views reinforces this. Often local materials are used. These are going to be local woods or bamboos or papers that are being produced near here. So there's a clear relationship with site and with natural landscape that is reinforced within Japanese architecture. And then some of the examples of how this relates to our world, you guys are going to go look at. So we will let Tina and Nick further elaborate on the Gamble House's relationship with Japanese influence. But the Gamble House is a really great example of how Japanese influence influences, I would say, upper class American interests. So the clients at this house have a lot of money. And they are interested in Japanese fashion. They're interested in Japanese antiques. They build this house very purposefully, representing a lot of Japanese objects or imagery. And you can kind of see how in this craftsman style, some of these heavy overhangs or the eaves, the deep eaves, are connected to Japanese architecture. And even over here, this notion of the landscape being an important part of the house. This landscape is definitely Japanese inspired. This little lantern shows us pretty clearly this overt, very overt, explicit relationship with Japanese architecture. So Nick and Tina, you guys will get to tell us and show us, hopefully take some pictures, show us a couple more pieces of what these relationships are all about. There are some very, very beautiful and overt connections to Japanese culture in this house. And then I can't remember if anyone's going to the Schindler House or not, but we will, regardless, talk about the Schindler House in the future in this semester when we talk about early California modernism. Because Rudolf Schindler absolutely references Japanese architecture. I think it's clear in the imagery here, the connection with the landscape. This is a flexible wall space, almost mimicking the idea of the shoji screen. And then you can even see some of these exposed materials start to indicate a very similar connection to Japanese architecture. So Japanese style is taken out of context, and I would say at this point, if we look back at the plan of Katsura, at this point I think you can look at this plan and begin to understand visually a connection with early modern architecture. So particularly when we talk about the Die Stil movement and we talk about the Bauhaus, the adherence to the grid, the asymmetry, the rationality, the interest in proportion, the non-centralized kind of organic quality about all of this. And then even in the interior, these materials that are very unornamented, undecorated, very geometric in their appearance and in their aesthetic, become a huge influence and a heavy influence on the German modernists. So even though I would say this perspective, when we're looking at the World's Fair, this is very United States focused. Japanese architecture and Japanese influences, both in detail and in massing, absolutely will influence ideas about architecture. And this plan, again, I keep coming back to this plan, this asymmetrical plan that is organic in nature is a direct challenge to the Beaux-Arts style of architecture. So the Beaux-Arts school being the predominant architectural school globally, or at least in the Western world at this time, is promoting very symmetrical designs, neoclassical styles, and this is completely antithetical to that understanding of architecture. And I think that this infiltration of Japanese culture into society in the beginning of the turn of the century and really as early as the 1850s, so right at that moment when the Industrial Revolution is taking over, we have new materials emerging, plays a huge role in defining what's going to be modernism for us. So we will continue to look at a handful of Japanese designers for the rest of the semester. So even though this is scheduled on the syllabus as discussing Japanese influence, at this point, Japanese influence is maybe a more categorical topic, but when we move into times that are closer to contemporary, there are many, many firms, furniture designers, architects, product designers that we can start to look at and look at a whole array of contemporary Japanese design that doesn't in aesthetic look like these traditional Japanese designs, but often a lot of the principles carry through. So some of these principles about framing views, about asymmetry, about obscuring boundaries, about flexible spaces, some of these principles will carry through into the contemporary Japanese projects that we'll look at probably more towards the end of the semester. So keep this in mind or reference it because it's documented on the internet here. Reference this later when we're talking about contemporary Japanese design.